Welcome to the MemSQL No Show. I'm technology correspondent Lisa Martin. Today we're talking about launch codes for SaaS success. Wondering what that means? You're in the right place. Two experts joining me today to talk to you about that. From Nucleus Security, we have Scott Kuffer, its Chief COO and co-founder. Scott, good morning, welcome.
Oh, thanks, Lisa. It's great to be here.
I should say good afternoon. He's on the East Coast. And MemSQL's own Field CTO Domenic Ravita. Domenic, hey, how are you?
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome everyone.
Yeah, excited to have you guys here. So we encourage you in the next 15 or 20 minutes that these guys are sharing their expertise. Drop a question, a comment in the LinkedIn Live chat. We'll address that. I always love to hear from you guys. In this time, we're going to be talking about a couple of things. First, Scott's going to give us a great overview of what Nucleus Central is and the vulnerability management gap that it found, what it's doing there from a vulnerability management perspective, challenging during these COVID times. Then we're going to talk about legacy data warehouse technologies, how they don't stack up. Dominic's going to enlighten us on that. And then, as always, we're going to leave you with best practices and recommendations on how to navigate similar challenges to Nucleus from both our experts. That's the plan. Scott, we're going to start with you. Just tell the audience a little bit about yourself and about Nucleus Security.
Sure. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. For those of you that don't know about Nucleus Security, we are actually a vulnerability unification platform. So we're designed really to fit into the process of vulnerability management. So for those of you that don't really know what that means or is, it's part of cybersecurity where essentially you're trying to assess your networks and all of your different technology stacks in order to figure out where you might be able to be breached by an attacker. And so the industry hasn't changed too much in the last 20 years. And so you've got all these different assessment tools, and you've got all of the different change management tools on the other side, where you're trying to figure out basically how an attacker can essentially attack you, and then on the back end, how you can actually fix all of those vulnerabilities before the attacker can find them. And so we kind of fit somewhere in the middle there, where we're taking all of the data across all of your different tools, and we're essentially unifying them into one location. And we're essentially acting as a broker for all of the tickets on the back end. So we're essentially acting as a triage layer for all of your vulnerability data. And the reason this has become really important and the gap that we're trying to fill has been in the push towards DevOps and cloud and containerization. You have a lot more data that needs to come in. You need to be able to move much faster. You need to be able to identify vulnerabilities in real time and take action in real time. And the traditional methods of vulnerability management just don't allow for that. So what Nucleus is trying to do is really to take all of your data across all your different sources and then allow you to take action on that in real time. And because we need to be able to do this in real time is why we decided to partner with MemSQL and a massively scaling database where we can essentially stream data and have a nice data analytics warehouse for us to use as our backbone to be able to keep up with the speed at which data needs to come in and out of our platform.
So let's unpack a little bit the earlier days, and Nucleus Security is quite young, I know that, but you started building the platform on a different database, on MariaDB, and ran into some performance challenges. Unpack that, help us understand what the block was and what you needed to do to alleviate it.
Sure. So a little background about us and myself also is that our entire founding team, it comes from the federal government space. And so we built Nucleus based on the challenges that we were experiencing in our jobs as vulnerability analysts and vulnerability SMEs for the US federal government. And so when we first built Nucleus, we needed to actually build it within the confines and the context of the government space. And so because of that, the federal government has an approved software list, and we thought that it would be difficult to basically try to bring in an outside technology back in 2011 or 2012 when we first started. And so we decided to go with MariaDB because it was built into the kind of standard Linux CentOS stack. And so we originally went with MariaDB, and then we were using Nucleus at that time to help us with the job that we were doing. But then when we were trying to convert it over to a commercial offering in 2016, we realized that MariaDB just didn't scale to meet the needs that we had, and we needed to actually try to find something else that would suit us better. And so what we were trying to do with MariaDB was essentially pre-calculate all of the analytics and the data structures that we needed in order to access And that worked in the traditional vulnerability management process. So part of this has been because of the shift towards DevOps, towards cloud. It required us to move faster. So in the federal government, they have basically 30, 60, 90-day scan windows where you're going to scan your entire infrastructure, once a quarter, once a month, and then you can chunk through all that data. You can then analyze it and then do something with it at that point. But what we were finding was happening is that there's this push towards continuous monitoring and applying DevOps principles to vulnerability management. And so we wanted to be able to ingest and process and calculate data on the fly very, very quickly as data is streaming in. And so we ran into some technical challenges with MariaDB in order to make that happen very easily. It just wasn't a very simple process, and so we started looking around for other options.
And how did you find MemSQL? I know you got a good start with the free tier. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So we had heard about MemSQL for a few reasons, but number one, MemSQL has a pretty good relationship with some of the users in the federal government that we knew. I believe that the federal government is actually a big supporter of MemSQL in a lot of areas, and so we had heard about it from one of our compatriots at a different defense contractor, and we checked it out, and we really were interested in it because we wanted to be able to essentially turn from a standard SQL database into a high-end analytics processing database with as few changes to our underlying code as possible. And so between MemSQL being essentially a drop-in replacement for MariaDB because they support the regular SQL syntax, and also the fact that they have a free tier where we were able to consume it and try it out and essentially wade into it to see how it would work, it made it very easy for us to actually evaluate and then make the decision that it was right for us. And so for us, the transition from MariaDB to MemSQL took us about a day to get all of our code and queries and everything updated, where we didn't have really to make many changes at all to actually get to the point where we were at least using MemSQL in a test environment under load and figuring out and trying to see what sort of performance improvements we were getting.
And on the performance improvements, we were talking previously, and you guys saw a 20x performance increase in your slowest scans with MemSQL compared to the legacy technology. So you were able to not only make such big improvements in performance and scale, but it also helped kind of launch Nucleus Security, pun intended, see what I did there, into the large enterprise market, which is really what you guys wanted to do.
Sure. So, obviously there are a bunch of factors that relate to understanding why database queries are running slowly. And we're not doing scans ourselves, right? So we're ingesting large amounts of raw data from all these different data sources. So we've got about 70 different data sources at this point. And so we need to be able to basically parse through all of that data, normalize it, and then essentially make real-time updates to that data from multiple different locations. But yes, what we were seeing was that for a lot of the slowest kinds of queries that we were doing to basically calculate certain types of metrics, being able to do real-time analytics, we saw about a 20x increase in speed on our slowest queries without any tuning or modifications to the queries themselves. And so obviously, since we have been able to really do a deep dive in our database architecture and kind of re-architect some things, obviously the benefits have been even bigger than that, but just kind of from a drop-in perspective, that was what kind of performance we were seeing.
Excellent, Scott, thanks. If you're just joining us, Lisa Martin with Scott Kuffer from Nucleus Security, Field CTO of MemSQL Domenic Ravita, talking about vulnerability management, lots of stuff under that. Domenic, let's move on to talk to us about with what Scott just articulated. You're a Field CTO. I've known you a long time. I know you engage really deeply with customers. Share some of the compare and contrast with respect to legacy data warehouses. We know there was one that just went public last week, but that kind of technology wasn't going to be able to help Nucleus Security achieve its goals. Talk to us about that.
Sure, thanks. There's quite a few things there in what Scott mentioned. First of all, just talking about the sheer variety of sources that are coming at you. 10 years ago, I worked with one of the managed service providers, data center providers, and they did a lot of work for government entities all over the world. And data sovereignty, control of that data is really important. IT monitoring, and the landscape in which those systems were doing the monitoring, had a certain assumption. It was built for the data centers of the day, and for the technologies and monitoring collection points. What's changed so much in the last decade is the adoption of cloud and SaaS applications, the adoption of IoT, and so much more sensor data. So when you're looking at what Nucleus is solving with that sort of new landscape, it's very much multi-cloud, it's hybrid, it's multiple data center technologies, both the legacy and the new. And as far as data movement is concerned, about where that data is resident, especially when you're solving the sorts of things that Nucleus is, there are regulatory restrictions around moving data from certain areas. And that's the idea of this regulatory or data sovereignty idea. And so you've got to bring the compute and the analysis to where that data is in many cases. With a modern database like MemSQL, it's provided, first of all, as a SaaS service in all the major clouds, but you can self-manage that. And our free tier allows you to run that free tier anywhere you like in Docker containers on bare metal. And that's an important flexibility option when you need to bring this kind of what we call operational analysis, I would say, to these sorts of problems. And what operational analysis or analytics is basically shortening the time to action. When you have a valuable opportunity to take advantage of, this could be in ad tech, for instance, or you're trying to avoid threats or mitigate threats, like in this vulnerability scanning situation. The time to action, not just time to insight, but when can you actually take a proactive action to capitalize on the opportunity or mitigate and reduce the threat. More and more systems we're seeing fit in this kind of thinking and framing, where it's a continuous intelligence that you're developing. You're continuously analyzing this data and taking action on it across many different sources and in many different environments. And in a nutshell, that's what MemSQL does best in these operational analytics scenarios.
And as we've heard from MemSQL several times before, companies in any industry need the now, especially during the last 6 months and however much longer our lives are going to be so impacted. Businesses are depending on data more than ever. There is more data being generated. And to your point, Domenic, if a business can't act on it quickly, then there's probably a competitor right behind them that's about to come in and potentially take their customers away. Scott, going back to you for a second, tell me a little bit about, from a performance perspective, how has the performance improvement that you've seen helped the company grow during the COVID era and really enable your customers to get the now?
Sure. So there's a couple things that I'd like to address there, and to Dominic's point as well, as far as data sovereignty and all of that goes. I should mention that one of the big benefits of us working with MemSQL was that we're able to deploy Nucleus anywhere, right? And so if you look at the federal government space, especially, or even just big enterprise space, they have different requirements from data, containerization and sovereignty kind of perspectives. And so being able to very easily scale out some sort of database architecture within the confines of what basically our customers want was a big benefit to us. But to answer your question about the performance itself, I mean, the performance is really the best part of it, is that it was designed to make it easy to scale, right? So it's not just the fact that it operates very quickly on specific queries. It's that as you add customers, as you add size, as you add more and more data, you're essentially able to horizontally scale it out by just adding compute to it. And MemSQL makes it really easy to do that specifically. And so it's not just high availability. It's kind of changing the mindset a little bit from your kind of traditional database options, right? Your standard SQL or some cluster or some kind of data warehouse somewhere, some OLAP style thing. You're actually kind of having a convergence of capabilities into one kind of analytics style database, which is really nice.
Yeah, and just one comment on that. Scott mentioned that he had started with MariaDB, which is a common starting place, MariaDB, MySQL, when new clients come to MemSQL. And those are really easy to get started. Those are single node databases, highly available. There's a lot of skill set out there. But they are not distributed native, meaning that as you start to try to scale them for continuous ingestion to the kinds of levels that Scott mentioned, 70 plus data sources, while you're simultaneously querying that data and require consistent and predictable low latency query responses so that you can take these actions in the moment. That's where they start to break down for these kinds of use cases. And the typical approach there is to use some kind of sharding middleware over top them, or to switch to some new addition. Difference with MemSQL here is that, first of all, it's easy to migrate from MariaDB or MySQL because we're MySQL wire protocol compliant, meaning all of your applications can use the same client driver to connect to MemSQL. And we're distributed native, so you can start with a very simple, something on your laptop, single node, and just add nodes horizontally or scale out, as Scott mentioned there, to grow, to handle the growing concurrency, the scale in concurrency, the scale in data, the scale in queries, for instance.
Right, and to kind of even add to that a little further, sorry, Lisa, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it goes beyond just the 70 data sources or the 75 different data sources that we're pulling in. It's also the scale of that data as well. So imagine what we're trying to do is, and what we are currently doing, is we're essentially getting streamed vulnerability data to us. And depending on the organization size, you can have upwards of 100 million vulnerabilities that you need to manage and analyze, right? So that's one of the core use cases we're trying to solve, is to help you make sense of this, millions and millions of vulnerabilities. But on top of that, you also have your team of analysts that need to come in, and while data is being ingested from all these sources continuously, you need to be able to make changes to that data and then calculate analytics off of that. And so how you handle basically the pipelines in while data is being changed in transit or at rest, and being able to kind of balance all of that in a quick way is very difficult to do, even when you try to use some sort of sharding middleware like you would use with a MariaDB.
All right, guys, in the last few minutes here, would love for you to share your recommendations and best practices for folks in any industry who are navigating similar challenges. Scott, let's start with you. From looking back at what Nucleus set out to do, the gap that you identified, you wanted to solve it, starting with a particular technology that wasn't going to allow you to unlock all the capabilities. How would you advise your peers, either in startup land or in established businesses, to go about doing this?
Sure. I think the biggest thing for us is that, even as technologists, we were pretty deep into technology, and even then we were not really aware of all of the options that we had when we got started in terms of how to architect our system. And so the number one thing I would recommend is to, before you even get started with laying code for the first time, is to start looking and seeing how the optimal way, what does your end state want to be? And I don't mean that, everybody thinks about that from a startup perspective as a business end state, like, oh, we want to go get acquired in 5 years, we need VC funding, et cetera. And they kind of neglect some of the technology pieces itself. And I think that's why we start to see some of the issues that come out with some companies that are not successful because they're not able to scale their systems. And so being able to think about your technology at massive scale from the beginning is extremely important. And I would say that's something that's overlooked quite frequently. And so basically evaluate all your options and figure out how you want to architect the app longer term, not just in this month or this year. You need to be thinking beyond just your first 100 customers. You need to start thinking much bigger than that.
Excellent advice. Domenic, let's wrap up with you. One of the things that you both talked about is how quickly companies like Nucleus Security, you guys switched from MariaDB to MemSQL in about a day. Domenic, when you're talking with customers that are in this sort of scale and speed challenge, this spot where they've got to pivot quickly, what's your recommendation?
Well, I think that MemSQL is a great option there. And when you're building a SaaS application the way that Scott mentioned, typically you're starting as a SaaS application because you're trying to scale quickly. You want to take advantage of the elastic nature of the cloud. And if that's the business thesis for your SaaS business, then you can build that in a simple way on MemSQL for free, as Nucleus has done, and many other SaaS businesses have built and started very simply for free, building their SaaS application there. So I think that when you look at simplicity, speed, scale, future-proofing your product architecture, which was what Scott's alluding to there.
Mm-hmm.
Can look at a choice like MemSQL, where you can get that and build the business and run the business in production on a free, scalable, cloud-native database that can give the operational analytics benefits that Scott articulated. So if you go to memsql.com/download, you can download MemSQL, run it anywhere, build your SaaS application on that, and get launch your business successfully in a distributed cloud-native way from day one.
Awesome. Domenic, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Scott, it was great having you. Thank you for enlightening our audience as to what Nucleus Security is doing and how you pivoted so quickly. We appreciate your time.
Sure. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks,
Scott. All right, Domenic, thanks for your expertise as always.
Thank you.
All right, we want to thank you for watching. If you tuned in late, not to worry. This episode will be on demand as soon as the live broadcast is done. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the MemSQL No Show.